In 1974, legislation in the form of the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act made the reporting of child abuse mandatory and provided protection for those that do report. That idea of what happens in my home is really nobody else's business has been openly challenged again and again when it comes to the abuse of a child. Unfortunately, that's not the case for the most common and yet the most underrepresented in court and the most underreported form of abuse. 60%, at least 60%, of households in America have had some kind of occurrence of sibling abuse. And this is not just sibling like bullying or rivalry, this is actual um, occurrences of abuse. For those that have studied this subject for many, many years and done research, those lines are still quite blurry. Identifying where sibling rivalry ends and abuse begins is difficult, not just for those that have been studying it, not just for educators, not just for mental health workers, but mostly for parents as they carry the majority of the responsibility. Um, Today we're going to talk about the difference between sibling rivalry and what constitutes rivalry versus what really characterizes abuse. And we're going to talk about some things that parents can really do to interject themselves and to keep rivalry from escalating into abuse. And so, sibling rivalry most often is fueled by big emotions, some kind of jealousy or competition. But rivalry, in most cases, um, is quite normal. Um, Children are learning about conflict resolution. They're learning how to define themselves and separate themselves from their siblings as far as individuality, as far as their talents, their interests. They are learning how to process big and strong emotions. Um, and those learning processes are extremely normal. Conflict is extremely normal. But what separates rivalry from abuse is really the intent. Again, rivalry is kind of fueled most of the time by jealousy, by competition. Maybe they're hungry, maybe they're tired. Um, but the biggest difference in the research that I've done is rivalry tends to go back and forth. It's not always one person doing, the provoking and the other person doing the responding. Kind of goes back and forth between who took whose sweater, who took whose toy, who's mad about what, who started what. It really is, it involves both parties, usually pretty equally. Whereas abuse is fueled a lot of times by that need for power. You'll recognize that intent to cause harm, that intent to really dominate, to manipulate. In most cases, there is an aggressor and there is a victim. It doesn't really go back and forth. Whether it's one case of abuse or it's serial abuse, it goes on and on and on. Typically, you are going to find rivalry goes back and forth over time. Conflict goes back and forth. Abuse, there's usually going to be one aggressor, one victim. When you're talking abuse, this can be physical, this can be sexual, and this can be psychological. Um, Legislation, legally speaking, abuse is um, defined by physical harm, emotional harm, sexual abuse, harm, exploitation, um, death. But the problem with the legislation and the problem with most definitions is usually that abuse is kind of covered if you're an adult or caretaker. It doesn't really mention, okay, same age, that typically falls into bullying. Um, Bullying and abuse are two different things. And so when you're thinking about the legislation and when you're thinking about the rules and the regulations as far as reporting and what to do, it's really extremely ambiguous because the law clearly states it's by a parent or a caretaker. I actually called into the National Child Abuse Hotline and I spoke with someone more out of curiosity and for clarification. Um, these crisis counselors deal with this kind of stuff on a regular basis, and it's one of the resources that is heavily used. When someone doesn't know how to report abuse, when someone doesn't know, do I report abuse? Do I try to handle it on my own? Is counseling going to fix it? And I asked a lady in her experience, this is not, you know, a big research thing or anything, but in her experience, um, she told me that the reporting of sibling abuse, what it comes down to is who did the victim tell, and did the victim take the disclosure, or did the, no, I apologize. Who did the victim tell, and did they take the disclosure of the victim seriously? Um, especially if the person that took the disclosure is a parent, but even as educators and healthcare workers, it can be hard to figure out, okay, um, what is this child telling me? What are they really telling me? Was it an accident? Was it horseplay? Were they playing doctor? Um, was one of the children provoked? What's the age range? What's the age difference? Especially as a parent, it is pretty easy to make the excuse, well, you asked for it, you were provoking. Um, what happened? Who did what? Um, that's just the way that you guys interact. You know your sister loves you. You know your brother loves you. You guys do this all the time. It's really hard, and unfortunately, parents are the ones who have the largest amount of responsibility, and yet it's the easiest for them to kind of shift to, okay, is my child dramatizing what's really happening here, or was it really an accident? Um, the main reasons that parents actually fail not just to take their children seriously, but they actually fail to report when they know something's really going on, they know abuse is happening, and they fail to report it. Um, Shame. They have to take that personally because, especially in America, I don't know about other countries, but what your child does is a direct reflection of you. It's a direct reflection of what you've taught them, what you've instilled in them. And instead of, you know, looking at the needs of their child, not just the victim, but the aggressor, both of them are children. Both of them need help, and instead of recognizing that and saying, okay, first things first, this is not about me, this is about my kids. What do I have to do to protect the victim? What do I have to do to protect the aggressor? What needs to be done to ensure that this doesn't continue happening? Is it severe enough that I need to report it? That line between, okay, my kid might need counseling versus I need this documented to ensure, one, that I'm doing my job as a parent, because anybody that takes care of a child is a mandated reporter. It's my job to make sure that I'm doing what's right, but it's also my job to make sure I'm doing what's right for my child. And so as a parent, it would be very difficult for me to set aside all of my personal feelings and say, okay, if I report this, what's going to happen to my child? Are they going to be taken from me? Is this going to stay on some kind of record for the rest of their life? How old are they? Are they going to carry this the rest of their life? Um, Parents, I mean, it's a difficult position to be put in. And when I was talking to this crisis counselor, she said that parents have the hardest decision when deciding, okay, what should be done and what do I do? And so it's it's pretty difficult. Um, and that's why most of the time, unless a parent is willing to stand up in court and say what their child has done to another one of their children, you're not going to see sibling abuse in court. You're not going to see reporters reporting on sibling abuse simply because, again, it is extremely ambiguous and there are no real laws, no real legislation that defines it. The main thing to keep in mind is, was the older child, which is usually the dynamic, older to younger, was that child in a caretaking position? Should they have been in a caretaking position? How does this reflect on the parent? And what can the parent do to minimize these risks? And right now, I'm just going to kind of discuss some of the risk factors for this kind of power dynamic and some of the things that parents, as the um, ones who hold the most responsibility, can do to minimize the risk of sibling abuse or that escalation from rivalry to abuse. And so, as far as risk factors, um, parents aren't around enough. That's one that um, leaving their older child in to take care of a younger child. They do that too often. If it's an inappropriate kind of age range, if the you know something that can be minimized. Acceptance of rivalry behavior and not putting an end to the competition, not putting an end to hitting, smacking, biting, kicking, normalizing that kind of behavior. A lack of modeling of healthy conflict resolution skills. Um, Parents actually can increase competition by playing favorites, comparing their children, labeling, but the biggest risk factor to violent behavior and to abuse from one sibling to another is exposure to violence in the home. Someone has taught this child or these children about violence, about inappropriate sexual touch. They've exposed them to pornography or allowed inappropriate media in the home, at a friend's house. These kids maybe have experienced abuse, and so it is not always the case that an abuser or someone that's been abused becomes an abuser. But especially with children, what's been done to them, what's been modeled for them, is something that they are extremely likely to repeat. And so, some things that parents can really do to minimize the risk is not tolerating behaviors that can potentially escalate to abuse, not tolerating any kind of physical violence, any kind of name calling, kicking, screaming, biting, just not tolerate that kind of stuff. It's their responsibility to teach their children how to use their words, how to talk through conflict, how to deal with conflict in a healthy way. Reduce the caretaking responsibilities, utilize after school programs, utilize daycare, but minimize older children taking care of younger children. Um, Interact with your children through their conflict and outline consequences, appropriate and real world consequences that go with the offense. And in my personal opinion, the biggest thing you can do with your children and for your children is talk about sex. Talk about boundaries, talk about how to protect those boundaries and how to respect those boundaries.